My name is Pat Ruckert, and we're going to discuss tonight, the title I put on it is General Sherman's March to the Sea, the Principle of the Flank, and the New Great March by the BRICS. A week ago, in discussions with his associates, LaRouche said the following. He said, "The United States is not simply a collection of local states. The United States is the name of a union which is indivisible, despite what happened in the period of the Civil War. And it means that the local states are not independent states as such. They are subjects of the United States. Their subject elements are integral to the United States as a whole. The idea that a particular state has its own independent right in terms of the United States is a delusion and implicit treason. There's only one United States. There are no separate states. That was a Confederate idea. We don't like the Confederacy. Now, the preamble of the United States Constitution makes that just emphatically clear. It reads, "We the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity, do ordain and establish this Constitution for the United States of America." In other words, it is the people of this nation that created the Constitution, not the states. They did it to form a more perfect union. They did it not for today's pleasures, but for the general welfare of all the people of the nation. And they did it not just for themselves, but also for posterity, for the generations not yet born. For the past 40 years, Lyndon LaRouche has campaigned with unrelenting determination for the creation of a new global system based upon the ideas expressed in the Constitution as exemplified in the economic policies of Alexander Hamilton, the American system. LaRouche's campaign, emerging over 40 years ago, was totally unexpected in terms of this financial oligarchy's expectations of some potential opposition to their globalized slavery. And similarly, our recently created Manhattan Project to evoke out of New York City a new movement that will give direction once again to this nation to in fact embrace and very concretely ensure that the United States joins with the BRICS. A flank, to put it simply, in politics, in economics, or war, is a creative action that is unexpected by your opponent. It's an action they did not think was possible. They did not think that you would carry out. An action, perhaps, that nobody had ever thought of before. An action that catches the enemy off guard and defeats him. And that's what was required 150 years ago, when the United States was in a great civil war, which, as President Abraham Lincoln said at Gettysburg, it was testing whether this nation can long endure. And as we shall see, it was doing what the Confederate leaders did not expect that in the end brought them to defeat and demonstrated that, yes, the nation can endure. From November 16th to December 22nd, 1864, exactly 150 years ago, right now, one of the most outstanding flanks in all of human warfare was carried out by General William Tecumseh Sherman as he devastated the Confederacy with his march to the sea. His 300-mile march was 62,000 soldiers right through the heart of Georgia, from Atlanta to Savannah. And in the process, he violated every rule and principle that was accepted as how to act in war. And as he did this, Sherman and his partner, General Ulysses S. Grant, were the generals Lincoln had been looking for since the beginning of the Civil War in 1861. He had been frustrated as the Union Army was defeated again and again by the Confederates, or was stalemated, because the Union generals were either incompetent, unimaginative, or merely career-minded. You know, what do I get out of this? You know, and these two generals, Sherman and Grant, lived the idea of our republic. They had no other agenda but to ensure it would be victorious and ensure that it would survive the greatest challenge to its unity ever in its history. To celebrate the idea that the United States is one unified nation, as LaRouche stated, tonight we'll join General Sherman in his march to the sea as we work to ensure the successful march of the BRICS. But first, a couple more lines or moments about the idea of the flank, because it's a word or phrase that is used quite often and usually by people who do not know what they're talking about. LaRouche has discussed the idea of the flank many, many times over the decades, always stressing that it is the power of the creative mind that looks for and finds that which had never before existed. In science or economics, it is the new idea that overthrows all presently accepted doctrines. In warfare, it is simply the action of ripping up all the war manuals from the last war and daring to do all that was forbidden to commanders to do. Too risky. You know, it's never been done before. You know, whatever other excuse. And so we'll have a few pictures here tonight. We'll start with President Abraham Lincoln. Throughout the 1850s, as the United States seemed to stumble toward a civil war, what would become the Civil War, our most creative president ever, Abraham Lincoln, positioned himself and prepared himself for the challenge to preserve the Union in the crisis that was developing. A crucial step Lincoln took in seeking the presidency was his speech early in 1860 at Cooper Union Hall in New York City, which put him on the map, so to speak, made him a contending major candidate for the Republican nomination for president in 1860. And of course, demonstrating once again the central role of New York City in giving direction to the entire nation. Lincoln was elected in November 1860. Yet a month before he took office, on March 4th, 1861, the Confederacy was created, led by South Carolina. All the nations of the South had seceded from the Union and claimed to be what they hoped was a new independent country called the Confederacy. And then, despite all Lincoln's attempts to avoid war, the British-supported Confederacy initiated it on April 12, 1861, by firing its cannons on the federal fort at Fort Sumter in the harbor of Charleston, South Carolina, which had led the Union, or led the states out of the Union. But since our focus tonight is not the Civil War per se, but something a little more narrow, despite all the interesting material that we won't cover, I think first what we'll do is we'll get to know our protagonists. General William Tecumseh Sherman and his partner, General Ulysses S. Grant. At the time of the outbreak of the U.S. Civil War, were probably the two most unlikely personages who would emerge to lead the Union battle. Sherman, born in Ohio in 1820, was one of 11 children of a state Supreme Court judge. But Sherman had to leave his family at the age of 9 when his father died, leaving his mother virtually penniless. And his very appropriate middle name, Tecumseh, was the name of an Indian chief, known for his intelligence and his cunning, and sometimes described as a great warrior. So Sherman grew up in the family of John Ewing, another Ohio Whig, as his father was, like Lincoln. Ewing was not only a prominent politician in Ohio, but soon to become a U.S. Senator, and then in the, which administration was it? I can't remember. But anyway, he served as the Interior Secretary. I think it was in the Hayes, not the Hayes administration, I forget. Anyway, so the Sherman was sent to West Point and he graduated in 1840. And during the next few years he was stationed at various army posts around the country, including in Georgia and South Carolina, which later in his march to the sea, this of course would be of invaluable experience. And Sherman had one habit throughout his entire life that also was helpful. Whenever he went from his home to somewhere else, he would always return by a different road in order to learn the geography. And he did it everywhere, all the time, his entire life. Right? Now, during the U.S. war with Mexico in 1850, he was stationed in California, and therefore he was not in the U.S.-Mexican War. And in 1849, President Tyler, that's who Ewing was Secretary of Interior for Tyler, read to the nation about the discovery of gold verbatim from a report from Army Colonel, Sergeant, whatever he was at the time, Sherman. He also helped to survey the city of Sacramento, and in 1856 was the Major General of the California militia that put down the vigilantes. Sherman also laid out the route of the California section of the Transcontinental Railroad in the early 1850s, almost a decade before Lincoln put it before the Congress and it was voted for. You know, so, and then later, when the Transcontinental Railroad was actually built in the middle of the 1860s and completed 1869, the route that Sherman had laid out from Sacramento to the Sierras was exactly the route Sherman had mapped a decade or more before. And then, where'd it go? So he was based in San Francisco most of this time, and at one point, some of the representatives of the Democratic Party asked him to run for city as a candidate for city treasurer, and Sherman said no. And he added, quote, "I am not eligible because I have not graduated from the penitentiary." Okay. So, but seeing no future for himself and his family in the Army, he resigned from the Army in 1853 while he was in California, and he went into banking. And remember, his foster father is a U.S. Senator, and so Sherman had all kinds of, very high-level political connections, so going into banking was fairly easy to do, but the entire banking system crashed in 1857, and that ended that career. So 2 careers down. He next became, he actually went into real estate. That didn't work out. And then finally, he became superintendent of a new military academy in Louisiana. A military academy, like West Point. No, this just began. 20 students. All the sons of planters, and a bunch of real assholes, you have to deal with, So he was not even in the Army when the South seceded. And he generally considered himself a failure in life. Right? The vote for secession, though, as it began in December of 1860 with South Carolina, and then in January with the rest of the southern states, that was a move he knew would destroy the nation, and he would not tolerate it. In a letter to a Southern friend, he wrote, "You people of the South don't know what you're doing. This country will be drenched in blood, and God only knows how it will end. War is a terrible thing. You mistake, too, the people of the North. They are a peaceful people, but an earnest people, and they will fight, too. They're not going to let this country be destroyed without a mighty effort to save it. Besides, where are your men and appliances of war to contend against them? The North can make a steam engine, locomotive, or railway car. Hardly a yard of cloth or a pair of shoes can you make." So the Civil War began when General Beauregard, the Confederate Army, began bombarding Fort Sumter on April 12, 1861. But during secession, Sherman resigned from his position as superintendent of this military academy. The military academy exists today, same one, but it's now known as Louisiana State University. So, but anyway, so he went to Washington, D.C. He was introduced directly to Abraham Lincoln by his foster father, Senator John Ewing. He was appointed to command troops and saw his first action at Manassas, or Bull Run. Then transferred to the West, he came in immediate conflict with Secretary of War Simon Cameron, who was in the area of Memphis or somewhere like that, and he met with Sherman. Now, Sherman told him that for Tennessee and Kentucky alone, the Union would need 200,000 troops. Right? Now, this is at a point, literally in the first couple months, where almost every politician in the country was saying the war will be over in 3 months. That's why Lincoln called for volunteers who would volunteer for 90 days. That's what virtually everybody in the country, and especially the top political leaders, thought. Right? Now, Cameron was a very corrupt and a very dirty guy. And he said to Sherman, when Sherman said we'll need 200,000 troops right here, he said to Sherman, "You're crazy, you're insane." And then he put the story in the newspapers. And newspapers all over the country were saying Sherman's insane. Right? So Sherman almost left the army at that point. But Cameron was soon fired by Lincoln for both incompetence and corruption. And Sherman's prediction that there would be the necessity of 200,000 troops in Tennessee and Kentucky, of course, was more than accurate. Like his earlier warnings to his Southern friends that if they started a war, they would be destroyed. And how at the end of the Civil War, he forecast the disaster that Reconstruction actually became. All this led some historians to call him a prophet. And like Lloyd Lewis, who titled his biography of Sherman, Sherman, Fighting Prophet. Now, Sherman did not leave the army. Instead, he linked up with another failure in life. Ulysses S. Grant. Now, Grant was born in Ohio in 1822, 2 years after Sherman. Named for the great Greek warrior, which Homer in the Odyssey actually spells that way, but Ulysses is the same figure in Greek mythology, right? The great warrior. He then attends West Point, graduates in 1843. He served with the army in Mexico, and after the war in 1847, he was shipped to the Pacific Northwest, up into the Oregon Territory, and then down to California. So he's in California at the same time Sherman is, but they really do not, get to know each other if they even met at all. Right? But he felt stuck, He's also accused of being drunkard, which later in the Civil War, when some were trying to denigrate Grant after the Battle of Vicksburg, and they accused Grant of being a drunk, Lincoln said, "Well, what's he drink? I'm sending him a whole case." So he goes back to Ohio after resigning from the army, and he failed in real estate, just like Sherman. He failed at farming. And when the Civil War actually broke out, he was a lowly clerk in his father's dry goods store in Galena, Illinois. right? Recruited by the governor of Illinois to organize the volunteers for the war. Because of his West Point background, Grant rapidly rose through the ranks, and by late 1862, was a general in charge of the entire Western theater of the war. Both of these men had no ambition to be the great general in this war. Reluctantly, especially Sherman, accepting promotions and advancement, which was based solely on their determination and competence. Grant first demonstrated this quality when he led the Union forces to capture the Confederate forts Henry and Donelson in early February 1862. These are on the Tennessee and the Cumberland River. And he captured these two forts in less than 1 week. Two of them, right? At Fort Donelson, the Confederates were forced to accept Grant's demand of unconditional surrender, or face the annihilation of 12,000 Confederate troops who became Grant's prisoners. Right? This was the first outstanding Union victory in the Civil War, and it made Grant's name a household word. And the press picked this up, and they noted that Grant's first two initials, U.S., were also the first letters of unconditional surrender. Therefore, Grant became known as Unconditional Surrender Grant. Right? But it was Shiloh in April 1862 where both demonstrated the qualities of leadership for which President Lincoln had been searching. The Union Army under Grant was preparing to attack the Confederate forces under General Albert Sidney Johnson at Corinth, Mississippi. This is early April 1862. Grant was gathering his forces together 20 miles north near Pittsburgh Landing and Shiloh Church on the Tennessee River. But on the morning of April 6, Johnson, who actually was a competent general, even though a Confederate, surprised the Union forces by attacking. And Sherman didn't expect it. And here we have that's Sherman, here's Grant, and this is Shiloh. First map. So Johnson's troops hit the Union forces about, right at daybreak when they're just getting up, and drove them back, and though thousands of Grant's troops panicked and fled, with as many as 5,000 of them, running to the Tennessee River, and they couldn't swim across. Some of them tried and drowned. Most of them just hid, under the banks, right near the river, trembling, for all the rest of the day. But that was 5,000 out of 60,000 or something like that, And Grant and Sherman rallied the majority of the Union forces, but were slowly pushed back by the Confederates, as you can see, back towards where the name Grant is. Pittsburgh Landing is right there. Right? And this is where the riverboats would come down, or rather, the river flows north at this point. Would come up the river delivering supplies. Right? Another army, Union Army, headed up by General Buell, was coming on foot from this direction. They should have been there by the 6th, but they were not. Right? And Thus, Grant was short about 20,000 troops that he had planned on when he was attacked. Right? So, in the late afternoon, though, General Albert Sidney Johnston was killed. Right? And he was replaced by General Beauregard, the same one who fired the first shots at Charleston on Fort Sumner. And Beauregard, confident of victory, said, let's take a break for the rest of the day. Right? And he called off the attack. Right? And said, tomorrow morning we'll drive Grant's army into the river. Right? Well, fatal mistake. Now here you see map 2. Union forces have been driven back almost to where the name Grant is now by about 6 p.m. Right? And that's when Beauregard called off the attack for the day. But it's a fatal mistake in warfare to actually, when you're winning, to stop and take a break. You know? So Grant and Sherman, all through the night, positioned their forces. And Buell actually arrived. And he was ferried over, another 20,000 troops added to Grant's forces. And Beauregard, did nothing during the night, did not prepare, didn't rearm, did nothing. And his troops, just ate their fill at the more plentiful camps of the Union Army. And Beauregard said, we'll attack in the morning, drive into the river. Well, before Beauregard could attack, even before daylight, Grant, Sherman, Buell all attacked. Right? And so map 3 gives you a little sense of it. The counterattack on the morning of April 7th. Right? Sherman was at the center of the Union counterattack, even though the day before, the first day of the battle, he had been wounded twice and had 3 horses shot out from under him. The Battle of Shiloh, with more than 20,000 dead and wounded, shocked the nation into finally realizing this was going to be a long and a bloody war. So, General Halleck, who was kind of the national security coordinator for Lincoln, was in the region, in the area, actually overseeing the armies, right? And he said this in his after-battle report. It is the unanimous opinion here that Brigadier General W.T. Sherman saved the fortune of the day on the 6th and contributed largely to the glorious victory on the 7th. He was in the thickest of the fight on both days. I respectfully request that he be made a major general. Right? So, by the spring of 1863, with Union armies, outside of what Grant and Sherman was doing, suffered devastating defeats, mostly in Virginia. Grant and Sherman, though, demonstrated for the first time how a powerful creative flank could turn the war. And this was the battle and siege of Vicksburg. Grant's forces began to campaign to take Vicksburg in late 1862. Vicksburg was not only a most important city in the West, but it sat high above the Mississippi River, and it controlled it. In order to make the Mississippi a major artery for Union transportation of troops and supplies, Vicksburg had to be captured by the Union Army. It had to be taken. But it was virtually surrounded on two sides by impassable swamps, and a third side by the cliffs overlooking the river. The only way in was directly from the west. And that area was just full of Confederate troops. So what were they to do? So here's a map of Vicksburg, and you can see, this is Vicksburg, this is the Mississippi coming down, and Vicksburg cannons are aimed right into the river. So any Union boats trying to get through had very little chance of actually getting through. Right? And you had the swamps and the bayous up here and down here, but way down here in Bruinsburg, then the land becomes dry. Right? So at a certain point in the spring of 1862, Grant says, to hell with it. We're going to run the gauntlet of the guns. Right? And he packed up the boats with bales of hay in order to try to deflect the cannon fire, the shot from the cannon fire, and he ran the boats with all the supplies down the river. The troops marched overland down to here, Bruinsburg. And then they crossed here to Port, and then marched to Port Gibson, and then marched toward the capital of Mississippi, Jackson, right over here, right? And fighting one battle after another with the Confederates, and winning them all. Right? But to do so, Grant had to abandon his own supply line. And for the first time, the Union Army raided and lived off the land. The farms and the cities and the towns they went through, they would take what they needed for the supplies of the Union. Right? So this, after one capturing Jackson, the Mississippi capital, then Grant's entire forces moved on Vicksburg, and a siege of the city began on May 18th, and the city surrendered on a very appropriate day, July 4th, right? Which was actually one day after the Union victory at Gettysburg, July 3rd. With those two victories, the war had turned. And it was assumed then by virtually everyone, especially the Europeans and especially the British, who had been contemplating entering the Civil War on the side of the Confederacy. But these two victories said the Union's going to win the war. But how much time would it take was the crucial question. The hundreds of thousands of dead and wounded Union Army troops suffered by the North was rapidly exhausting the North's population of tolerance, their patience. 51,000 casualties at Gettysburg alone. And you got to think about that. The entire Vietnam War in over 10 years was 56,000 dead. Gettysburg alone had 51,000 dead and wounded. So the population said, when is this going to end? We cannot take this too much longer. Right? So by the spring of 1864, Lincoln had called Grant east, put him in command of all the armies of the Union, and promoting him to lieutenant general, a rank only previously held by George Washington. But I want to give you a little sense on the Vicksburg battle or siege, right? Before they actually began the siege, as I mentioned, they had been battling for a couple of weeks or more, one Confederate force after another and defeating them, right? So before the siege began, this biography of Sherman states the following: in the 20 days that had passed since they crossed the Mississippi, they had claimed 250 miles of the river, fought and won 5 separate battles, not to speak of endless skirmishes, captured the state capital, marched 180 miles, made 6,000 enemies throw down their muskets and surrender, killed and wounded as many more, seized 27 heavy guns, 61 lighter pieces, and they fed themselves. Right? That's what an army can do when it has leadership. So Grant is now based in Washington, D.C., but he refused to stay there. He said, I'm going to be in the field with the troops, so he's in Virginia. So in the spring of 1864, with Grant's unstoppable or unrelenting attack on General Lee's armies, which the Union Army on the East Coast had never done, right? And Sherman beginning his march to Atlanta from Tennessee, the outcome of the war and the existence of the nation rested on these 2 leaders. By the end of April, Grant was locked in a deadly pounding war with Lee, and which would essentially only end in June, with Grant on the outskirts of Petersburg, just south of Richmond, the Confederate capital, and a 10-month siege began. Now, while Grant held Lee in Richmond and Petersburg, Sherman was essentially assigned to destroy the Confederate armies in the West and destroy the ability to feed and supply Lee's army from the rest of the Confederacy. The campaign was described as a hammer and an anvil, one pounding and one being the anvil that the subject would be pounded upon. So by this time, Sherman was thinking a little differently than he had when the war began. Because he has a lot of Southern friends, lots of them, right? And he was not an abolitionist. He thought slavery was stupid, but he was not going to fight to abolish slavery. He was fighting to save the Union, right? So that's how he began. But by the spring of 1864, he thought of himself as the destroyer of illegality and rebelliousness, the scourge of the lawless, the punitive force, the performer of work that someone must do before the gentle tasks of healing could begin. Right? That's how Sherman began looking at himself. Right? Now, he began his Atlanta campaign, and in his invasion of the state of Georgia, he demonstrated one of the most remarkable movements of a large army against a not quite so large, but very competently led opponent. You know, the most remarkable campaign in military history up till that point, and probably still today. Facing the Confederate forces of General Joseph Johnston, which interestingly, it was Johnston who surrendered to Sherman in April 1865 after Lee had surrendered to Grant. Right? So, but Johnson was a very competent general. Right? For nearly 3 months, as Sherman marched his troops from Tennessee down to Atlanta, a couple hundred miles, right? He would approach Johnson's lines and then go around the flank. Right? And Johnson would have to fall back 20 miles and set up a new blockade of Sherman. And Sherman would approach the next line and go around the other way. Right? And Johnson have to fall back again. Only one time did they actually have a head-on collision, and Sherman, said, "I was right. Doing this doesn't work," and because he got 2,000 of his troops killed. Right? So, and Johnson would not come out and fight Sherman directly because he had a much smaller army than Sherman did. Right? So, but President Davis of the Confederacy thought Johnson should fight him. And finally he removed Johnson and he put in General John Bell Hood. And Sherman said, "This is the happiest day of the campaign," because Hood was, impulsive. And Sherman knew Hood would attack him. Right? And Sherman knew that he would defeat Hood every time he attacked. So you get a sense of, even during the war, how much respect for Sherman's flanking capability from a Southerner, a Confederate, who'd been captured by Sherman's army, and he said, "Sherman will never go to hell. He will flank the devil and make heaven in spite of the guards." So backed into, being backed into Atlanta at the end of July, Hood repeatedly made forays out to attack Sherman and just lost more and more troops. Now, so a siege of Atlanta began, with Sherman pouring artillery into the city and sending out forays of troops for miles around, ripping up and destroying all the railroads. And of course, taking all the food and fodder that his army needed. Even though Sherman was maintaining a supply line 200 miles back to Tennessee, a railroad that he had to deploy thousands of troops to guard from Confederate cavalry raids. Right? So, Atlanta's completely surrounded, under siege, and Hood fled the city with his troops on September 1st, and Union forces moved in 2 days later. The fall of Atlanta was celebrated in the North like no other victory. It guaranteed Lincoln's re-election in November, because during the spring and summer, with the population tiring of the war, even